Good morning, everybody. It's so good for you to join this meeting. We think it's a very important meeting of the all-party parliamentary group, First Do No Harm. Today, I'm delighted to say that we have a joint meeting with the BMJ, and Dr. Fiona Godley, the editor of the BMJ, with her team have been, I have to say, unrelenting in their support for our report and its recommendations, and I do thank them for that. So today we're considering recommendation 8, which seeks to establish a register of financial and non-pecuniary interests for doctors hosted by the GMC as a central resource. So a warm welcome to Fiona, as she and I are co-chairing this meeting, and also to, of course, the patient groups, the campaigners, the fellow parliamentarians, members of the media, and fellow panelists who will be speaking at this event, and also the review team, who I'll introduce in a minute. So today I'm joined by the members of the review team, and Sir Cyril Chandler. Cyril, if you would like to show people where you are. Thank you. Simon Whale. Simon's also a member of the review team. Thank you. Dr. Valerie Brass. I'm not sure she's on yet. And Dr. Sonia MacLeod. I don't think she's with us at the moment. So I'd like to start with just some simple housekeeping information. First of all, the fellow panelists, the parliamentarians and the colleagues from the review, and I are on screen throughout the event. And we recommend that you select speaker view to ensure you're always following the person who's talking. Other attendees don't have their cameras and microphones activated, but we have a Q&A function enabled. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use that function, and we'll get through as many questions as we can in the time available. And before I pass on to Fiona, I'd like to introduce the meeting from the BMJ's perspective, and I want her to do that in a minute. But before that, I should just offer you some background on why we're holding this meeting and why we think establishing a register is so vital. Now, many of you have followed the work of the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review, which concluded last July. And its report, First Do No Harm, concluded that transparency of payments made to clinicians need to improve. As such, we recommended that the register of the General Medical Council should be expanded to include a list of financial and non-pecuniary interests. And that was for all doctors, as well as doctors' particular clinical interests. That, of course, should be on the register, and their recognised and accredited specialisms. Now, the recommendations also made the case for mandatory reporting for pharmaceutical and medical devices industries of the payments made to teaching hospitals, to research institutions, and also to individual clinicians. So the case for such a register is actually, in my opinion, a very clear one. And I'm glad to have with us a range of expert voices to add to our discussion. So Fiona, I just wonder if you'd like to say a few words about why the BMJ is so interested in all this.
Julia, thank you so much, and very kind of you to call the work of the BMJ unrelenting. It has felt like a long haul, and you can see the record of that long haul on bmj.com. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Rebecca Coombs, who's on this panel, who has been helping to lead that campaign along with her team of journalists. There's been some really heroic campaigning from people on the front line, patients, doctors, some of whom you'll be hearing from shortly. And I think your review, Julia, does represent a landmark event, which we all hope will prove to be the tipping point to push this over the line, a tipping point which moves us from the question of whether a central register of doctors' interests is needed, which I think we feel the answer is a resounding yes, to how, what, where, and when. And I think what we have seen is patients' shocking testimony, really, to your review, and certainly in coverage in the BMJ and elsewhere, calling for this, their need for the knowledge of whether their doctors have commercial interests relevant to their treatment, and whether or who is paying their doctor. And I'd like to reference also Chris Van Taleken, who's on the call here, who's done some really fantastic work on this more recently as well. What we've also found is that doctors are moving towards understanding the need for a register and beginning to even welcome it. And very good that we have Professor Neil Mortensen on the call. We'll be hearing from him later to show support from the colleges. Professor Mortensen is the president of the Royal College of Surgeons, and other colleges have really begun to step up, I think, and say, yes, this is necessary. The current systems of voluntary declaration, various different systems, are chaotic, hard to navigate, burdensome, confusing, do not serve patients or doctors. We have models from other countries, 7 other countries, including Latvia. I feel the need to mention that, Romania, but also America, France, Denmark, where registers exist and mechanisms exist for people to know who is being paid by whom. The UK is behind on this. That we hope that this discussion will really explore how such a register would work, with the role of the GMC crucial to making it happen and overseeing its success. So with those few introductory remarks, I'd like to open the panel discussion, and the first of our speakers is Dr. Margaret McCartney from Scotland, who is a GP well known to readers of the BMJ as a fantastically compelling columnist, a campaigner, and has been leading, certainly from the general practice community, on this issue. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you for asking me to speak today. And I'm very grateful to the APPG for taking this work forward. So why do conflicts of interest matter? Well, conflicts of interest matter hugely in medicine because conflicts create bias, and bias creates poor quality information, and poor quality information can kill people and give them life-changing consequences. This is not just about sandwiches being delivered by pharmaceutical companies for hospital meetings. They're actually the gateway drug, and they're the gateway drug into industry, causing a pervasive problem within the NHS. So it leads to conflicts through industry offering travel and conference fees to doctors, or via identifying professionals who are then polished into existence as key opinion leaders and industry allies, giving talks, ushered onto guideline panels, or it's via industry getting involved with patient campaign or charity groups, making awareness campaigns, inevitably calling for more diagnoses and more treatment for people. Well, why is this a problem? Well, research finds that conflicts of interest makes healthcare more expensive and poorer quality. So look to America and the opioid crisis, where we can see that opiate drugs were promoted for non-cancer pain, causing addiction and premature deaths to thousands and thousands of people. Well, the guidelines recommending them were at risk of bias because many authors, and I quote from research, had pervasive conflicts of interest with the pharmaceutical industry, and there were a paucity of mechanics to address this. And of course, we have the Cumberledge Review. So back in 2004, I was a junior doctor, and I was horrified by the impact of industry even then. And I wrote to the Health Select Committee, who were at that time investigating and reporting on this. And they recommended in 2005, and I quote, that a register of interest be maintained by the relevant professional bodies, the GMC, RCN, Royal Pharmaceutical Society, detailing gifts, hospitality and honoraria. And of course, this never happened. In 2015, we found poor practice in research and declarations of interest in NHS hospitals in England. That was Harriet Feldman and Ben Goldacre's work. And then we had the Malcolm Grant Review in 2016, which resulted in trusts being given standardised documentation to try and improve practice. Now, as Fiona rightly says, other countries legislated for Sunshine Acts, forcing transparency. Meantime, in the UK, we got Disclosure UK, a voluntary register published by the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, which therefore does not cover technology, food supplements or devices, and unsurprisingly, it's voluntary and most of the money is undeclared and goes missing. So myself and my small research team have been researching the state of current practice in the UK. It's not yet peer reviewed, but in the top line, we think there are big problems. A third of registers that we found are older than 2 years. Only 12% of registers were actually asking for the value of the interest that were being declared. And only 16% were explicitly stating the actions that were to be taken to mitigate the risk of a declared bias. So in some hospitals, over a third of consultants and pharmacists were not making a declaration of interest at all. Also, this is a massive bureaucratic load, not just for doctors, pharmacists, nurses, whoever is being asked to fill them in, but for the hospitals themselves, who are having to connect with doctors and staff, and then to write these massive registers, which are often, we are finding, tedious, repetitive and unintelligible. How are we meant to use something that just doesn't seem to be working properly? We're going to be doing more work over the summer on this. We'd love to get in touch with you about this, but we so far think that our systems just now are poorly designed to be useful. And that's a big problem. We can see that some professionals are worrying endlessly about declaring small boxes of chocolates that they're receiving from patients. Meantime, other trusts are publishing registers with redactions of names of staff receiving thousands of pounds for activity with industry. So we need to be clear, it's a small number of professionals who have, via guideline committees and key opinion leaderships, a disproportionate impact on healthcare. We need a system where staff without conflicts can make that declaration quickly and easily, but where staff with conflicts must do it properly. And a good register would be proportionate and welcomed, I think, by many. So what should a register achieve? It should be able to reduce workload while increasing functionality and efficiency. A central register would mean that a person knows where all a doctor's declarations are kept, can find it quickly and easily, and if it's properly designed and tested, would make those declarations actually useful. This would also mean that every university department, journal and employer knows where that declaration is and does not have to ask for another one, just to ask that the doctor confirms that it's correct. It would save time for everyone. Patients cannot be expected to hunt for multiple buried registers and trust websites where they may not even know who the doctor's employer is, and pharmacists and nurses need to do the same. So I think we need to move forward, but we must ensure that what we do is developed and fit for purpose and tested properly. We must also be clear that this is only the first step to an effective management of conflicts. It must not be allowed to give moral license to professionals who feel that if they've declared a conflict, they have therefore managed it. They have not. We can only manage conflicts if we know they're there, so this has to be done, but it's the beginning and not the end. We must not also expect patients to do the work of identifying and managing conflicts of interest. They should expect that professionals will do their ethical duties. So in conclusion, a central register is the first step. It's long overdue, and I would love to have this in place before I retire.
Margaret, thank you so much. This is a really cruel way of trying to encapsulate the years of research that you've done on this in 5 minutes. So thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to introduce Kath Sampson. Throughout the review, we were very, very keen to listen to patients. And really, we felt at the end our review was their review, because the review was simply built on what we heard from patients. And Kath, you were one of the leaders, and I just want to thank you for the work that you do, and to say that, of course, you're the founder of Sling the Mesh, which you set up in 2015, and you have now over 9,000 members. And I know that the purpose of Sling the Mesh is to work to protect patient safety and to improve medical education and practice across the UK. So thank you for coming today, and we look forward to what you're going to tell us in your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for inviting me here to speak. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to talk about what does a conflict of interest mean to patients. And for that, I've dug out 2 examples. The first of which is Johnson & Johnson, who gave £20,000 to the British Society of Urogynecologists to fund a database. Now, this database was supposed to capture the outcomes of an operation of a mesh sling for incontinence. But all that database did was ask one question, and it's called the PAD test question. And it's as simple as you might think. Women were asked, how many tenor pads are you now using after this operation? So there is 20 years worth of data of what looks like successful outcomes from the mesh sling. There is absolutely no data capture at all of pain, complications, infection, autoimmune disease, lost sex lives. I can guarantee you on the group there were women in wheelchairs, walking with sticks, suffering extreme depression from that very operation, but the database captures none of it. My second example is a surgeon who took £100,000 from the makers of a particular mesh he was studying. This mesh is called a TVTO, and we know globally it causes extreme groin and leg pain for women. However, this surgeon suppressed those negative outcomes in his results. He said it was a good treatment option with low risk. That TVTO mesh has now harmed thousands of women around the world, and that £100,000 conflict of interest only came out 7 years later because of a whistleblower. So what does a conflict of interest mean for treatment options? There is plenty of evidence out there to show that it leads to prescribing bias. It means healthcare professionals may offer treatments that aren't better for the patient and certainly aren't cheaper for the NHS, but it just might mean they've had a great golf session, or maybe they've been invited to a conference abroad in a luxury 5-star hotel. Whatever way that conflict has come, it definitely can lead to prescription bias. Now I'm going to ask, what is it that us patients want? We demand a central and open database so that we can see all of the conflicts of interest from healthcare professionals and from industry. That reporting has to be mandatory. We cannot rely on voluntary reporting, and it needs to be twofold. We need healthcare professionals to report into that, and we also need industry to report into it, from the payments they're making to doctors, healthcare institutions, research and teaching hospitals. So what has been offered so far? Well, so far it looks as if the government want to build on what is already existing and what is already failing. There is a voluntary system at the moment whereby senior leaders of hospital trusts are expected to report their conflicts of interest. However, a report by Ben Goldacre showed that out of 223 trusts across the UK, only 31 provided enough information to be able to assess conflicts of interest. So already that system is failing. It doesn't matter if you extend that system up to all healthcare professionals. You cannot rely on it to be on voluntary reporting. And in addition, it is vastly unacceptable to expect patients like myself and others to go trawling around individual trusts to look for conflicts of interest. And plus, we may not even know where a surgeon works, or they may work at multiple outlets or be a locum. It is not good enough. Also, what is deeply concerning, there has been no mention from the government so far of forcing industry to report the funding they give to healthcare professionals. This element is only being looked at by the Department of Health now, thanks to immense pressure being put on them by patients like myself at Sling the Mesh. Finally, I'm going to close on the Queen's speech from last week. She said the UK is set to become a life sciences superpower for research and innovation. I understand that we need research and innovation. I understand that we need new and improved healthcare treatment options. I also am fully aware of the need for the UK economy to get back on its feet after the pandemic. However, this must not be at the cost of patient safety. I urge the government to pass legislation for mandatory reporting of conflicts of interest by both healthcare professionals and by industry. And by industry, I mean pharmaceutical and medical device makers. We must protect the patients of tomorrow.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Julia. And Kath, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think we all would say your courage and clarity and commitment to this has been quite extraordinary. And as you said, you've got now 9,000 active followers on your own group, but that represents a much larger, I'm sure we would all agree, patients across the UK who are thankful to you for the work that you've been doing. So many thanks indeed. We turn now to Professor Neil Mortensen, who is the President of the Royal College of Surgeons and Professor of Colorectal Surgery at the University of Oxford. Neil, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Yes, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm speaking on behalf of the Royal College of Surgeons of England and the surgical community. Of course, the college is not a regulator. We can nudge, we can influence, but we can't compel. We completely agree that transparency of payments made to clinicians needs to improve. And as a college, we support the principle of providing guidance for our members. And surgeons are already used to declaring interest at conferences and when they publish in learned journals. So there certainly should be an open disclosure of interests. We think that a simple single annual disclosure should include any financial interest in or support from medicines or medical device companies and support from companies for travel or educational activities. Any proposed register should have, number one, accurate information, and medics should be able to easily upload their declarations of interest, their disclosures at minimal expense. It should be light touch to make it work. It should be easily accessible, as Kath has asked, and there needs to be some sanction for failure to submit. I don't think a voluntary register would be good enough. I'm personally used to filling in an annual template of my interests as part of my annual appraisal. The advantage of having something managed locally is, of course, is that the medical director can then actually discuss that potential conflict of interest with their relevant clinician and have a person-to-person discussion about whether that interest is appropriate or not. Just being on the register itself won't necessarily change behavior. Whether it's right for the GMC to hold this or not, I'm not sure. Perhaps it should include other healthcare professionals. And finally, on a lighter note, I have to say, as far as surgeons are concerned, such a register would mostly make very dull reading for the majority of them. Surgeons have fewer temptations than our physician colleagues working with Big Pharma. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks very much indeed, Neil. And of course, you came and gave us evidence when we were running the review. And I do take what you say about being a light touch and accessible. And Cyril Chandler will be saying something about that in a minute. But we're moving on now to Professor Colin Melville. And I want to thank you so much for coming today. We know that the GMC is ambivalent, to put it at its extreme end, perhaps, and really is not very keen on this idea. But if I could just say that your position, of course, is that you lead the regulatory duties for all stages of medical education at the GMC. And it includes advising doctors on professional conduct, performance, and medical ethics. And I know that you joined the GMC in 2017, having previously held senior leadership roles in medical education at Lancaster Medical School, Warwick Medical School, and Hull York Medical School, and of course, the North Yorkshire East Coast Foundation School. So thank you so much for coming. Certainly it's a subject that you know a lot about, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you, Chair. As you've already said, yes, I did give evidence to the review in 2019. It's good to be able to come and hear the voices of other people and also, again, to speak to the audience today. It can't be right that patients are not made aware of any real or even potential conflicts of interest when making decisions about their care. I don't think any of us disagree with that. At the time the review was published, we agreed with its findings, and that has not changed. But this meeting provides us an opportunity to explore the best way forward to do that, and it has to be for the benefit of patients. I know that there will be some on this call who've been affected either because of personal harm or suffering to a family member or friends, and others of us, I include myself, been deeply affected by the stories and the findings of the review. and want actively to work for change. Of course, as we've said, the decision on how ultimately the review findings are implemented rests with the Department of Health in their response. I can't speak for them, but for us, there are some important principles. Neil has perhaps alluded to some of them already, that we need to consider before assessing whether or not a central register is the right solution to this particular problem. So firstly, it's critical that the information provided must be accurate and up to date so that patients can have confidence in it. Second, it needs to be easily accessible, a point already made, and in a way that's useful to patients and for patients. Thirdly, those principles need to be enforceable so that the public can trust that the information is credible. And finally, as already mentioned, there is a spillover into healthcare, of course, as a multi-professional function. And so the issue is not solely restricted to doctors. Our guidance for doctors in good medical practice already says that doctors must be open about conflicts, declaring their interests formally. It requires doctors to declare any interest and explains in supplementary guidance that when there is doubt about a conflict, they should act as if it's there, irrespective of whether it relates to financial dealings or not. But it does rely on doctors being able to identify where a conflict might exist. I'm not trying to downplay that. I think there is a genuine confusion for some sometimes, but then declare the corresponding interest. And we do think employers have an important role here, whether it be healthcare providers, academics, or medicines and medical device companies. They're well placed to help to test and highlight which conflicts exist and should be declared. They'd also be better able, we believe, to take into account the context of someone's role. I mention this because conflicts are contextual, and as an NHS consultant, my membership of professional bodies supported my clinical role, but they weren't necessarily a conflict. But since 2017 and working for the GMC, they are now conflicts of interest and are declared and published. So without addressing those quality assurance issues, patients wouldn't have confidence in the information they see, and it could undermine their trust in it. So whether or not a central register is established, it's something we need to get right, and strengthening the local processes would still be critical to its success. And there are some existing mechanisms in place that could facilitate this. The process of annual review and job planning conducted by doctors is one example. And although steps can be taken to improve the coverage, including rolling it out within the independent healthcare sector, healthcare organisations, certainly in England, already required to publish and maintain updated registers. I know the point about a central register has been made, but we think that patients are more likely to look at their local healthcare provider because that's where they're seeking the healthcare from for information, rather than from a central register. But if we were required to provide it, of course, we would publicise it. Finally, I've already mentioned that the point about multi-professional. So it does feel to us that a local solution could provide information in a way that's just simply more obvious and accessible to patients. Because ultimately, this is about what's most useful to patients and how they would use those declarations to make informed choices about their care. So whatever the final decision from the department when it publishes its response, we hope it takes those points into consideration. However, that doesn't stop us from taking actions to help create a more transparent and honest culture. And I wonder if I could just touch on a couple of things. I've already, it's been mentioned that my role is as director for GMC's standards function. And that includes the guidance we've had on conflicts of interest, which I've already referred to. But last year, we also updated our guidance on decision-making consent. And this now makes clear that serious harm can result from patients not being listened to, not being given relevant information, the point that Kath highlighted. It highlights the importance of declaring conflicts to enable a patient to make an informed decision. And in updating that guidance, we made sure to reflect on the findings of the review and learn from it, particularly on the importance of informed consent and involving patients in decisions about their own care. And we'll take learning from this into the review of our core guidance, Good Medical Practice, which we have just started. So although we want to see the outcome of the specific recommendation, I do want to reassure colleagues that we are already acting on the review for the benefits of patients and for patient safety. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Melville, for that, and for setting out your 4 principles, which I thought nobody would disagree with. I think our problem, though, and we'll see what comes up in the chat line, is that when it's done locally, it's not always fulsome. And I just, as somebody who has to declare their interests every 6 months as a parliamentarian, and we as parliamentarians know that we have to do this, and it actually is good for us. It protects us. And I think, well, anyhow, we won't go into this debate, but because I hope lots will come on the chat line with all the people who are listening to the event today. But I'd like to move on to Sir Cyril Chandler. And Cyril, we've asked Cyril to look at how this really could work. And maybe it's a belt and braces in that local areas will need to also obviously be involved, but also we want to ensure that those patients who move around the system will have a central resource that they can go to. But Cyril, perhaps you'd like to come in now.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Well, as we've heard, the General Medical Council already works with others to ensure the professionalism of doctors and to keep patients safe. These include employers in the NHS or those organisations where the doctors work in the private sector. Well, some time ago, I was chairman of the Standards Committee as an elected member of the GMC. And I termed the way that the GMC works with others as the way conscience and contract reinforce each other to serve patients. So the GMC maintains the register of qualified practitioners. In fact, this is their main function. The register is available for inspection by the public. They also establish standards for practice, as we've heard, set out in Good Medical Practice. And they also work with specialist associations and the colleges to maintain the specialist register. The process of appraisal with revalidation as appropriate is an example of how the GMC does work with others, the private sector, the specialist associations, and with the colleges. So we can apply these considerations, it seems to me, to the question of how we might create, maintain, and use a register of interests. Now, it is my view that the GMC should be responsible for this, and it would have to be, it must be mandatory. And I also think the public need one place to go to obtain the information, which I believe is their right to have. But the GMC do not need to do it on their own. They need to do it with others, which will help. The employers, the private sector, the colleges, the commissioning groups, they need to help. And it can be organized, it seems to me, around the appraisal system. Each doctor would need to complete or update one form and only one form each year. And this would be a standard form agreed by all concerned, the GMC, the Department of Health, the colleges, the Independent Health Providers Network, and also the doctors' representatives, including the British Medical Association. Now, such forms already exist and are mandated to be used by some hospitals. I would suggest a small group led by the GMC and the department develop such a form quickly and by consensus with others. The form would be checked and validated by the appraisal process, both in general and specialist practice, and then it would be lodged with the employer or contractor or private hospital or clinic as appropriate. But it would also be accessible to the public on their website, with importantly a link to the GMC register from which it will also could be assessed. There are commercial organizations that provide digital support to assist appraisal, and they might help develop the process. Now, there may be some registered medical practitioners for whom this process would not work. And in those cases, the GMC would, in fact, hold the register of interest And again, it would be accessible via the register to the general public. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So now we've got an opportunity for people to ask questions. And Fiona, it's over to you, I think, for this session.
Thank you very much indeed, Julia, and thank you so much for all the speakers. I wanted to ask a first question that's come up to Emma Hardy, who is Vice Chair of the APPG. Emma, thank you so much for joining us, and a Member of Parliament. We have a question which comes from Peter Wilmshurst, who people may know is a cardiologist who's been a whistleblower really quite substantially to the GMC over a period of years, and can't sadly join us because he's operating today. But his question is really about why register doesn't currently exist. And he asks, is the lack of a register of financial interest of doctors an indication that politicians and the General Medical Council value more the interests of doctors who gain from undisclosed conflicts of interests than they value the patients they harm? Emma, give us your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, it was something actually that was raised in a debate I led in Parliament back, a Westminster Hall debate on the use of vaginal mesh in, I think, was it October 2018? Kath will probably have to correct me, over the use of, over register of interest and how we can include it. So it's something I think parliamentarians have been talking about at least for the past few years, and there were promises sort of seem to be made on the use, on introducing a register of interests. I think I like to think the best of all fellow parliamentarians, so I'd like to think it's because maybe the lack of attention that's been shone on this issue and awareness raising with other parliamentarians. But we have a debate coming up, which will be on the do no harm. So I'm hoping that in that debate it will be put forward to government once again as to why this matters and why this is important. But it's certainly on our radar. That's all I can sort of say in response to that at the moment.
Thank you very much, Emma. I wonder if it would be helpful. We've got a lot of very good questions coming through, and I'm going to try to give composite questions, if I may. One of them, some of the questions are about, what's so special about doctors. You mentioned, Julia, that politicians have to declare, and lawyers and judges. Doctors seem to feel that they are above this. I speak as a doctor myself. I wanted to ask Chris Van Tulleken, who people will know from his work on the BBC, as also an infectious disease doctor, about why do doctors think they're special, and how has industry shown its sophistication in making use of that special status of doctors?
So I think there are two ways of thinking about this. First of all, in some senses, doctors aren't special, but they are the subject of what we're talking about, or the object of it. Doctors do have a unique power in terms of the way we are perceived by the public, and in terms of our power to influence not just individual patient decisions, but also guidelines and policy, that we all act at some sense at a micro and a macro level as de facto regulators of multiple industries, not just pharma, but also devices, also food and nutrition. And so I have these three areas of interest, really. I'm a broadcaster, an academic, and a physician. And so I see this through those three lenses. As a broadcaster, I notice my media colleagues, and it is doctors in the media who have enormous influence and power. We are widely trusted and listened to. And many of my media colleagues have deep and very, very undeclared interests with a number of industries that I see clearly influencing their broadcasting. So media doctors are one problem because the public trust us and listen to us. Rightly or wrongly, I'm afraid I think they do listen to us perhaps more than many other healthcare professionals. There aren't nurses and physios very much on morning television. As a physician and as an academic, I study viruses as well as industry and conflicts of interest. And I see this through an evolutionary lens, that with every advance in the regulation of and limitation of conflicts of interest, we see the enormous power and sophistication of industry in circumventing that. And I guess the area I understand this best is infant nutrition, where things are put in place and industry have complete control of the entire landscape of information about how to feed children, whether it is the basic research, the social media websites where they fund dietitians, the medical education, the patient education, and the institutional funding. So, and however you advance, so industry will evolve, and we need to keep pace with that. So I think we need, as physicians and as a community here online, to recognize the power that doctors have, to recognize not just that we need to declare, but I want to underline what Margaret and everyone has said, which is that sunshine is not the disinfectant we think it is. But also we need the hermeneutic of suspicion. We need to see that industry has legal obligations to growth and revenue. That means that their interests are not the same as our interests as clinicians, and are not the same as our patients. So I and this may sound slightly radical, I remain deeply suspicious of profit motives in health. And I think the first step is what we're trying to do here, which is get doctors to declare. And the subsequent step is really then to remove that influence. Industry aren't stakeholders, they're not partners. We are there as de facto regulators. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Chris. We don't have a representative industry on this call, so it would be interesting to hear from them in response to that. But the various questions coming in which relate to this problem of the failure of voluntary systems and local systems to be successful. Kath, I think as a patient, tell us your response to that. Why have voluntary systems not worked? Could we make them work? Does it have to be mandatory?
It absolutely has to be mandatory, nothing less. You can't rely on voluntary reporting. It hasn't worked so far. I don't see anything different. Just by asking nicely, it's got to be mandatory, and there's got to be consequences if they don't. And we've already seen it's not working at trust level. The APBI voluntary database, Disclosure UK, that's not working. It's just it's not good enough.
And the other issue is, of course, the fact that we have got this Disclosure UK. If that were made mandatory, would that be sufficient?
That wouldn't be sufficient either, because that's only the pharmaceutical industry, and it doesn't cover medical devices like mesh, PIP breast implants, metal hip implants, and we all are deeply aware of those scandals. So that, again, not good enough.
So we have to ensure that it covers the entire industry of devices.
Yes.
and medicines. Thank you very much for that. Thank you also for the questions coming in. Do keep them coming in. Neil, you mentioned about the fact that surgeons are perhaps in some ways less vulnerable to this because it's more about devices than about drugs. And I'll just come on in a minute to what we've heard from the other colleges. So Rebecca can fill us in on that. But before I do, the issue about, do devices make it even more important that surgeons declare because of the need to train surgeons in certain device technology, so they become more loyal, if you like, to certain specific devices?
I think that's a very good point. I think to add to that, obviously as part of Julia Cumberledge's report, there was a call for registries of implantable devices. And one of the difficulties about devices as opposed to medicines is that the long-term effects of the implantable often take some time to become apparent. And so that's why the surgical world is different in a way from the medical world. We will implant a device and it will be there for many years. So its consequences will have a long reach, as it were. So I think you're absolutely right. I think we must be part of this initiative, but I think hand in hand with a disclosure has to go the registry of the implantable too, for the best outcome, the best regulation for our patients, and to prevent bias in surgical practice.
Thank you very much, Neil. Rebecca, in the work that you've been doing for the BMJ, you can tell us that quite a few of the colleges have now taken a positive position in support of a central register. Could you bear to give us the roll call? Because Neil's representing the surgeons. It'd be nice to know that we have a broad swathe of support. You're on mute, Bex, sorry.
Yeah, of course. The BMJ wrote to 6 faculties, 14 Royal Medical Colleges and the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges about the register, and we asked all of them whether they agreed that there should be a mandatory and public register of doctors' interests in the UK. And in the responses that we received, it was a 90% response rate. 9 out of 10 of those bodies said that they did agree. And they include the Faculty of Public Health, the Royal College of Anaesthetists, the Royal College of General Practitioners, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow, the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, the Royal College of Physicians of London, the Royal College of Radiologists, the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, the Royal College of Surgeons of England, Royal College of Emergency Medicine, the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. So, and just in case you're wondering, the organisations with no official positions yet are the Royal College of Pathologists, and Psychiatrists, and the Royal College of Ophthalmologists.
Thank you very much. I think what people can hear listening, and those on the panel, that is a really fantastic roll call of support for this. You know, it does seem that we've moved beyond whether doctors can support such a measure and needing to move into how it can happen, which is, I think, the next focus of the conversation. So I just wonder who on the panel would like to begin on this question about what the barriers to this have been. The questions coming through are, you know, what is preventing the General Medical Council from taking this on? What is preventing the Department of Health and Social Care from recommending it and supporting its progress? So, Colin, sorry to come to you first off, but it would be very helpful to understand the challenges that the General Medical Council face, whether they, you know, at some point it feels that the GMC could embrace the role that it clearly, most people on this call seem to accept, needs to take in overseeing such a register.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Do you mind if I just respond on an earlier point? The GMC is here according to our overarching objective to promote and maintain the health and well-being of the public. We're not here for doctors. I think that that's a common thing. The council, Cyril will know this, the council has slowly reduced its number of doctors from being 100% to being 50% and in a much smaller number. So it's very clear. My own background is as a doctor, but I'm very clear my role here is about protecting the public, and that is obviously key and important. To your specific question, I don't think it's an objection in principle. This is more about, so a number of people have said we should have mandatory reporting. And what I'm trying to work out, if you like, in my own mind is, how do we go from lots of people say we should have this, and therefore why aren't they volunteering it already? And now we're going to a place where we have mandatory. How do we make it mandatory? And that seems to me to be something about the partnership between those who have the conflict that needs declaring and the organization or body that is asking them to do something which creates that conflict. So the register, it feels to us that the register alone is not the solution. It's the mechanisms by which that register is correct is the important bit. And whether it's locally maintained and nationally collated, or nationally maintained and locally deployed, you end up with a similar position. So I think it's more about meeting Kath's point, which I think is about how do we make it mandatory? Our guidance says you must declare. The question then is, are people declaring it? Do they realize they need to declare it? Sometimes that's not always obvious. There are probably small numbers who are obfuscating on declaring, maybe. But ultimately, it's how you get that information together. And I think that's where, for me, it feels conversations are quite useful in testing. So you do this work for so-and-so. Do you not think that's a conflict that should be declared? And so on. So I think it's that two-part thing. And there was a question in the chat about, you know, do I think industry and pharma should be mandated? Well, actually, yes, I think the whole system should be mandated, and it's how we join the dots between the parties to make sure that the public and patients have the information that they need to make their choices. So it's more about the mechanism, I think, than the key point. course, we are only the regulator for doctors. That would be just the point that I would raise on that. Oh,
Thanks,
there's lots of
Colin.
hands up now.
Thank you so much, Colin. I'm going to bring Margaret in to answer, but I think just to capture what you've said, speaking for the GMC, you're saying there's no doubt the GMC thinks this should be mandatory. That's it seems to what you're saying. It should be mandatory. So that's a very important step. I don't think that's been said before, to my understanding, and therefore we need to find a way to make it mandatory, to make it function in that way. So I'm going to hand over to Margaret and then to Julia. Margaret first.
I'm delighted to hear that, because it absolutely does need to be mandatory, and the only place that doctors have to do something with every year is the GMC. Every year we must be registered in order to practice. The GMC are the only organisation with whom we have to have a relationship once a year. We have to touch base, we have to pay our fees, we have to sign on, and we have to say that we're fit to practice for another year. And that's why the GMC, in my mind, are the only people who really can hold this register, because they're the only people who know who all the practicing doctors are in the UK. If you work in a private hospital, if you work purely in research, you may not have an NHS employer. How is someone meant to find your declaration? But put it with the GMC, and you know where to find a doctor, because they have to be registered there. The GMC has to know who you are. We are currently, myself and Dr. Twizzle Brown, we have research that is going to go on, and hopefully within the next 6 months we will have developed a conflict of interest or a declaration of interest form that should hopefully be fit for purpose. We want to design and test it to make sure that everything that everyone could ask you about your declaration of interest can be put in one place. We want to test it, and we want to get this done properly, and we would really love to have a pledge from the GMC that they'd be willing to work with us on that, because we would really need to bring this forward. As I say, I don't want to retire with all this work not having been completed.
Thank you. How long have we got, Margaret, before you retire? You don't need to answer that. Thank you for that, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed, Fiona. And I just want to actually say to Professor Melville, I would much rather the GMC decided how they want to do it. And Sir Cyril has explained very clearly how it can be done. And I would rather it was that than it is actually debated and passed in the coming bill, the Health and Social Care Bill. And I don't know what Emma feels, but we know we'll have a lot of debate on it. People will come up with all sorts of ideas. And in the end, what could be a very simple, straightforward system led by the GMC, who could then set an example to the other organizations, the professional bodies who would want to do it for their professions. I would much rather it was that, because I know what happens when Parliament gets very closely involved. And we saw with the Health and Social Care Act of 2012 that it started off as a very slim lined act, and then there was a delay, and David Cameron, the MP, said we need to think about it further, and it ended up a Christmas tree. It ended up with all sorts of things put on it. Now, I think that if it was led by the profession, by the GMC, after all, you are the most important regulator for patients, in that it is the doctors who make the decisions on the whole, etc. And so I just would ask the GMC to rethink this, and to really don't be in the hands of the parliamentarians. Lead the way, be ahead. And I think that would actually produce something much better.
To give Colin time to answer that, I'll just ask Emma whether you want to add emphasis or disagree with Julia.
I think obviously Julia is absolutely right in that I am quite sure that we will put forward an amendment to the Health and Social Care Bill when it comes through, and look at making it mandatory if the profession hasn't led on it. And I was interesting when she was talking about it being a Christmas tree. I thought, oh my goodness, have you seen the police crime and sentencing bill? I mean, that's become the biggest Christmas tree there ever has been. And you're quite right that we could end up with a similar situation. As with all things, and I say this coming from an educational background, I think when the profession leads on it and has obviously the deeper level of understanding than the majority of parliamentarians have, and I count myself in that on this issue particularly, then I think that would always be the best way possible. But if the profession can't lead on it, then the parliamentarians will. And I think either way, we're going to see this will end up becoming mandatory. And how much better would that be if the profession had a system in place and working effectively before it was forced to?
So just to a secondary on that, Emma, so people are asking in the chat about the Health and Social Care Bill, and is that the vehicle? You're kind of saying it could be, but it's not necessarily. I mean, because that's the other question we've had is, does it require legislation to make this change? I know in the past, with the General Medical Council, there has been that view that they couldn't make the move themselves. They had to require legislation. You're saying it doesn't need that, but it might end up that way.
I'm saying that it would always be far better for the profession to lead on issues like that itself. But if it's unable to or unwilling to, then it will end up being made mandatory anyway. And I see the Health and Social Care Bill as a really good opportunity. But as you know, with any parliamentary session, different pieces of legislation come through where you can add amendments to this, and we're always looking for where we can bring forward an amendment. And as chair of the APPG for MESH, it's something that cross-party members are really keen to see enacted. And of course, in the House of Lords, there's a huge appetite to be seen to make this mandatory. So my message to the profession would be, you know, lead on this first before we have to force through the legislation to make it mandatory.
And the timing on the Health and Social Care Bill, as far as we know it, how long has the profession got?
Well, you have to talk to the other team, I'm afraid. I'm not quite sure when the government intends to bring that through, but I would expect this parliamentary session is my understanding, but maybe Julia will have more insight than I on that.
Do you know that, Julia, the time frame, or does Simon know the time frame?
All I really know is that unlike the Commons, the House of Lords don't have any guillotine on debates. And we can talk, and we can talk, and we do, and we go on forever and ever. Everybody comes in. And I have to say, in the House of Lords, there are a lot of people who have huge expertise, and they are full of ideas. And I think if the profession were leading this, it would be just so much better. Because, Colin, in the end, you could end up with something you really don't want at all. And that would be a great pity. So I just urge the GMC to lead the way.
Colin, I won't promise that not all the questions will be directed at you, but this is the key issue.
Yes, they will.
Sorry, no, I'm looking around. But this is a really key issue, isn't it? Is could the GMC act? Is there a willingness there to act? How could we, the wider community, help you in that? And you know, we would all like to see that happen. So what do you feel is the next step?
Can I make some subtle points of distinction which are kind of appear to have come out, which I think are probably not helping? I set out that we're a patient safety organisation. We're here for the benefit of the public, and then you're including us in the profession. I think that distinction is quite important. We are a regulator, we're not part of the profession. If the profession were to come forward and say that's what we want, then I think that would be quite a strong voice. Ultimately, for us to hold it, of course, would require a government decision, because it's not within the powers in our Act, it's not part of our role. And of course, ultimately, I feel like we are not, by the way, in the pockets of government. We are an independent regulator, accountable ultimately to Parliament. We're not accountable to government or its government department. So I think I know those are subtle distinctions, but I think they're quite important to understand that, you know, we can't just put our hands up and say, oh, we'll take this on. It's not quite as simple as that. But if the profession were to say, yes, that's what they want, then I'm sure a mechanism would be found to do that. But those checks and balances points that I keep kind of coming back to are absolutely critical to make it work. It's no good having a mandatory register if people still don't declare. We can't check 300,000 doctors every year ourselves. It requires other parties to be involved in that. So I know that perhaps sounds like I'm being a bit defensive. I don't mean to be. I'm just trying genuinely to explore a positive way forward, given our central role in that as a regulator, but not part of the profession.
I've Emma wants to speak. Kath, I was going to ask Cyril to respond to that, and possibly Margaret, but just to briefly say, I think just to capture that, we've said the GMC thinks it should be mandatory. you're saying the GMC can't make it mandatory. It's not in your power to make it mandatory. Is that what you've said, Colin?
So our guidance says that doctors must declare. So in that sense, we've made it as mandatory as we can, but our powers only mean that we can investigate when someone says a doctor hasn't declared something that they should have done, rather than proactively going out and finding out. So
And
that's
it
the
would take Parliament, in your view, to change that. I thank you very much, Colin. So I'm going to go for Emma, Kath, Cyril, and then I'll see who else is around. Emma.
Thank you, Fiona. It was just very quickly, I put a message in the chat apologising that I have to leave for the next meeting, but thank everyone for arranging this. Look forward to continuing to work with you all, especially when we have the timetable for the health and social care, and just thanks to everyone involved. So apologies. I've got
Thanks so much for joining, Emma. Kath.
Yes, I just want to make an important distinction here. And of course, we all agree that clinicians should be reporting their conflicts of interest. As patients, we want that to be mandatory. But I just need to make a really important point here that we must mandate industry to report as well, because that's where the money actually comes from in the first place. And that must be mandatory. And I can only see legislation sorting that element out. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Thank you.
That's very important. So the triangulation between the
Yes.
medical professionals and the industry. Thank you very much. Cyril, your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Well, there are two questions being discussed. One is one that Kath has just raised, which is about industry and the Sunshine Act in America. And our recommendation 8 includes that as a separate issue. And I think that is a very important issue. And I think Parliament needs to do that. In America, it's done by government. So that's one issue. The issue we're talking about, particularly this morning, is about a register of interested doctors. And I would ask the GMC, who I love dearly, I worked for them for a long time, to really consider what I've suggested as a way forward. They can't do it on their own. But then a lot of things that GMC does, they don't do on their own. I mean, in my day, we discussed a lot about revalidation and appraisal. And certainly by the turn of the century, we thought we had it pretty well organized, though it did eventually take an act of Parliament to make it happen. And I accept that Parliament may have to act, but much better it acts on the advice of the General Medical Council, as we've heard. And the bill is a way of doing that. The bill is already intended to modernize regulation, so it's going to include issues related to the General Medical Council. So I'd ask them to go away, consider what Margaret said, what I've said, what others have said, and lead.
Thank you, Cyril. Margaret.
Yeah, I am, and we are very happy to work with anyone to try and pull this forward. Kath is absolutely right. There needs to be triangulation. There must be a system. I mean, if Sainsbury's know exactly what it is that I'm buying every week and I'm likely to buy next week, there must be a system by which we can work out what's going missing and where. You know, which doctors are making declarations, but which or are not making declarations, and where is industry money going. It must be possible to get good enough data that we can actually work out what is going missing and where. But the bottom line is, this has to be something that will improve the experiences of patients and doctors and of colleagues who are using guidelines or are being influenced by people who are key opinion leaders. And the bottom line is, if we don't get a system that is adequate to do that and to make the system actually fit for purpose, we may go to a lot of wasted effort. So my plea is really to develop a system that's based on evidence and which is tested adequately and which has the confidence of practitioners, particularly practitioners who have nothing of consequence to declare, and make sure that everyone can get behind this so that we really do make a lasting improvement, and that at least all the awfulness of mesh and Primidos actually has something positive at the end of the day to show for all the suffering.
Thank you, Margaret. Chris.
Thanks very much. I wanted to ask quite specifically, actually, and I know it is directed at the GMC and Colin. It's not clear to me where someone like me would report. I've got an honorary clinical contract. I'm an academic, and I don't, I might not publish over the course of a year. I don't declare it the BBC, although maybe I should. There isn't a mechanism. So Colin said, we've made it as mandatory as we can. I mean, mandatory is a binary state. It's not about making it more mandatory. We accept it is mandatory. It's about the GMC making it possible for doctors like me, for all of us. Not all of us fall into a sort of clear clinical path. And I think there's a problem here that the GMC is going to may find itself at testable legal risk. Their mandate is to protect patients, not the profession. And we've seen this mounting body of evidence that patients are severely harmed by commerciogenic illness, by profit incentives, and by conflicts of interest. And as that body of data becomes more robust, the GMC may find that that legal case is tested in court, where patients take them to court as being responsible for harm. And so I wonder if it just would be way better if the GMC said, this isn't a legal problem. Legally, we're mandated. All you have to do is create a website. And the question of enforcement is just, we all do what the GMC says, because otherwise you take our license away. So I think it's about making it easy for us, and the enforcement comes with your enormous power over the profession.
Thank you, Chris. I'll just read out a few comments that are coming through in the Q&A. Really helpful to hear from people. Jackie Shaw says the GMC is known by everyone as a point of contact for information and reporting. From a patient point of view, makes perfect sense. That's where we'd look, not our local trust. Amy Jane Meluish is saying that technology is the answer. That you made a lovely comment about technology can check millions of individuals on a daily basis. No more excuses, please, and thank you. So there's a general sense that voluntary is not the way. We know that now. Local does not seem to be what patients are asking for, and doctors not knowing where to report is really what Chris is saying. Perhaps we could move the discussion to a few practicalities about how the wider community could help to make this happen. There's the pressure from the colleges we've got, or at least the support of the colleges is obviously going to be helpful. There's continued patient pressure. One of the questions is, what about the independent sector, the private sector, doctors working for private hospitals and insurance companies? Where would they be, their work be captured? And also people providing expert witness statements. One of the commentators talks about the fact that people who were previously inserting mesh are now become legal expert witnesses in the cases. What about their declarations of interest? I don't know if anyone wants to pick up any of those topics about the next. I mean, building on Cyril's suggestions, building on the suggestions about the centrally controlled, locally accessible. Kath, how are you feeling in terms of the discussion on those points?
So for me, it all comes back to legislation and using the Health and Social Care Bill as a vehicle to do so. And I actually think that the comments made by Colin are very relevant in terms of needing the legislation. It actually does. So as much as we'd like to put pressure on the GMC, I think the only way to do that is to involve government, involve legislation. And if the Health and Social Care Bill is the vehicle to do that, then that's certainly something that I'm sure patients would get behind and put pressure on for. And
the private sector, Kath, you obviously had thoughts on how to bring in that.
Oh,
it's not just the NHS is the point, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And that's a really difficult area. In terms of solution, I'm not sure, but in terms of what I've seen, there's a high number of women who had mesh surgery and indeed mesh removal in the private sector. So they certainly need to be brought into this as well. Quite how the solution of that is, I'm not sure, but the amount of certainly mesh surgery there has been quite extensive.
Thank you very much. One of the other aspects was asked right at the beginning. Again, this comes from Peter Wilmshurst, which was about the extent to which this needs to expand towards not just individuals, but also payments made to academic institutions, to medical societies and to journals, because those payments also influence treatments given to patients. And I should say that the BMJ does declare the income we receive from industry every year. So that may be another issue that I don't know, Julia, whether you feel that's an important issue. to extend it beyond the individuals to make sure that institutions also declare. Julia, I don't know if you have a comment on that.
No, not really. I mean, I was just thinking about the distinction that Colin, you were making between the profession and the regulator, and I do understand that. But I just, I do think that it's really important that the GMC do try to frame the legislation. I have no doubt, absolutely no doubt, this is going to come in the health and social care bill. We will obviously debate it and everything else. But if there was a strong lead already, that would be very helpful to the parliamentarians. And you in the end would get what you want, the profession wants, the public wants, what we want for safety. And of course, I do take the point that industry must be mandated as well. Of course, that's right. And so I have no doubt it's going to come in that bill, and it'll come through the Commons, and if it's guillotined, it'll come to the Lords. And we will, I am sure, have a huge debate. And just with the Patient Safety Commissioner, we managed to get the government to agree to that appointment because of the strength that we managed to put forward during the debates. And I want to support what the GMC thinks would be a really good way forward. And I would like to do that. I would like to mandate it because clearly you want it mandated. I would like to mandate it, but I am anxious that we keep to what is practical, as Cyril has already outlined, and the way forward. And if we have something that is clear, concise, ensures patient safety, involves the patients and the professional bodies, I think that is honestly the way forward. But anyhow, Chris, I think you wanted to come in. Sorry, Fiona, you're running.
That's good. No, carry on, Chris.
It was a mistakenly. I forgot to take my hand down.
You were acknowledging that you were cheering Julia on.
I'm cheering.
Cheering in the background. Simon, I wonder, as in your role as as someone who understands the legal situation, and with the work at Luther Pendragon, what do you think of Chris's concern? I think it's framed like that the GMC might be subject to legal challenge if for various reasons they fail in their duty, which Colin absolutely acknowledges, the duty to protect patients as a result of not making this mandatory or not moving on this.
Well, thanks, Fiona. I should say I'm not a lawyer, so I would hesitate to give the GMC or anyone else legal advice. But I think, as you said, Colin, the GMC's primary purpose is to protect the public. And if it's the case that a lack of transparency and a lack of a comprehensive declaration of interest amongst doctors leads to unsafe outcomes, then I think from a lay perspective, there's a direct link there between the GMC's ability to protect the public and to do everything it can within its power to protect the public, and those shortcomings that could result from a lack of transparency and patients making the wrong decisions in the absence of the knowledge that they deserve to have.
Yes.
But I'd just like to add to the point that's already been made and underline it, this point about what we're calling triangulation is really important, that it isn't just about doctors declaring their interests. And we said this in the review's report, that it has to be, that's the first step, but alongside that, or shortly after that, we absolutely need industry to ensure that it is fully declaring. And if that requires a Sunshine Payments Act equivalent in this country, then so be it. And I hear what Julia and Emma have said about Christmas trees, but the Health and Care Bill, when it does come through, could well be an opportunity to raise the Sunshine Payments issue as well.
And of course, Sonia knows a lot about that. And Sonia, you haven't had a chance to come in today, But
Sonia,
Sonia is our senior researcher, and I just wondered if, because you know a lot about these payments.
Sorry, were you about the sunshine payments or about the GMC's role? Which were you?
Both. We'd like to hear both.
All right. Okay. One of the things I would say is that it's really important actually to look at the way the GMC is not a fixed position. It is an evolving position. It has continuously evolved, and its patient safety sort of incorporation into its duties have evolved considerably. I mean, you don't actually need to go back that far. I think it was 1983 or 1984 when questioning or impugning another doctor's skills and ability to carry out their work was potentially a fitness to practice offence. So the GMC has evolved hugely over that time and has to continue to evolve and has to continue to look and to say, okay, as we go forward now, what do we need to do to really ensure we are doing everything we can to protect patient safety? And that, to my mind, very simply, I don't think anyone would disagree that a register with interest in does that. So I think it's really looking at a way to make this feasible and to make it as simple for patients to navigate and also simple for professionals, because you don't want an onerous system. So I think that, yes, the GMC has to look and not just say this is where we are now, but how do we take this forward to really optimize what we're doing for patient safety? And in terms of sunshine payments, I don't really think there's a lot I can add, except to say it is hugely important that we have both sides of the equation covered, because there are some situations where people, I mean, Chris mentioned earlier, people receiving, sort of doctors receiving payments from food and nutrition companies. Now, those wouldn't be covered by a sunshine payment. They're not medicines, they're not devices. So you need both sides of the equation to ensure that a doctor declares them, and therefore everyone can see where the influence is potentially coming from.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I wonder, we should bring this to a close in a moment, but it seems to me that that there is the General Medical Council's role is evolving. There is an acknowledgement of the need to make this mandatory. There is a sense that that's going to, one way or another, despite Julia's hope that it wouldn't, will be a process of legislation. But there's a time period now when the framing of what this thing should look like and how it might work is you know, there's a precious time where in good faith people could work, the colleges, the General Medical Council, those people who have got good information to share, the expertise that Sonia's just shared. I wanted to just see if I could find, sorry, forgive me, quickly, Victoria, you've mentioned you're a QMUL researcher and I just can't find your message, and you've found, you've been doing research on conflict of interest statements. Gosh, there's so many messages. Here we go. Victoria talked to Brown. So I wanted to link you up with Margaret, unless, in case you're not already linked up. You know, what does a conflict of interest statement look like? What should be in there? Do contact Margaret McCartney. I'm sure she'd love to hear from you. And then the mechanisms by which people would be monitored through their appraisal processes. So those sort of issues need to be hammered out. And I don't know, Colin, you know, whether it's possible for you to say, well, how would the GMC welcome that input? What would be the mechanism by which that would happen from now?
So as I said in my opening remarks, Fiona, you know, we want to work with other people on providing a solution. I think in my mind, maybe I've misunderstood something, but in my mind, I think we've got a couple of things muddled up. Making it mandatory still leaves the responsibility with the doctor to declare, and that's the current situation. It just means that there's a mandatory register, and that's perhaps the missing step. As a regulator, of course, we take action if the standards aren't met, but we can't intervene at every consent decision and say, hang on a minute, have you declared your... So there is a challenge in the practicality of how the regulator can do its job. I'm sure Chris would love a legal case taking the GMC to court, but I'm not a lawyer either, by the way, but I would find that quite difficult to imagine on what basis. So the nature of regulation tends to be reactive. What we're trying to do is to do more, as we call it, upstream, to raise awareness amongst doctors of their responsibilities, because that way the trust and transparency will be improved. And that's where we want to get to. So we will work with others. There's no difficulty in that, in finding the right solution that is of benefit and gives the right information to patients.
Thank you, Colin. Before I hand back to Julia to close, just a quick run through of one sentence each, if I may, from people on the panel. Cyril, what would be your final comment?
Well, the private sector is important, but it's working much more closely now through the appraisal process, through a thing called a DEPT. I declare the interest that I'm a non-executive director of the Private Health Information Network. And we are working very much more closely with the NHS to improve the appraisal and the standards in the private sector. And I did mention that in my talk. The other thing is, Sonia says the GMC has evolved. I was there when Good Medical Practice was written, but particularly under the leadership of Donald Irvin. And it has led to a more proactive way forward, and that was represented in the appraisal system. And that is key to this, because that's the way it can be validated and made to really bite. So I think we can make progress on this, but it does require some leadership from all of us, including the General Medical Council.
Thank you, Cyril. Neil.
Well, I'm sure the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges can work with Colin to maybe put some flesh on the bones of Cyril's suggestion of a light touch solution.
Thank you very much indeed. Margaret.
Yes, just to say I'm so pleased that this meeting has taken place at all. What I think the problem is, though, is this is a problem that we've all recognised as a problem. And problems like this need a system solution. It's no point kind of raising awareness or telling people, you know, this is what you should do just now, because people forget, people are busy, stuff happens, people change jobs, people move around, you know, and people like Chris have got portfolio careers, I do too. We should be working on a system solution to this, a really robust system solution that allows this to be the natural way of things. So every year you register with the GMC, you give them your loads of money, and in return they ask you, please can you update your declaration of interest? It's done, it's there, it's open, it's transparent, we can research it, we can make sure it's fit for purpose. Why don't we move to a system solution that stops relying on individuals doing the right thing? Most people do want to do the right thing, but we should make it easier for them to do that.
Thank you, Margaret. And a final word before I hand back to Julia from Kath.
I would say I'm really grateful for the robust debate and all of the questions. Thank you so much. I think my closing point would be conflicts of interest can lead to flawed scientific evidence, which is then used to influence NICE guidelines. There's many mesh studies that shows it as low risk or is low quality evidence, and therefore the complications are downplayed. So I think my closing remark would be, we have got to tackle conflicts of interest because we can't have another mesh scandal happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath. And sorry, one last word from me before I hand back to Julia. Just to thank those of you who put in questions. There's a great many of you reflecting exactly what Kath has said, the harm that you have been exposed to as a result of unmanaged, undeclared conflicts of interest. And certainly from the BMJ's point of view, we will continue to campaign on this matter. And we're deeply grateful to all of you for your input, and certainly to Julia and her team for this fantastic review, which we do believe is the tipping point. Over to you, Julia.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Fiona. And thank you for all the work, all the people who put into this event, and of course, especially today, our panelists. And I do want to say how much I appreciate Abby Rimmer's article that was published, I think, last night, about why do we need a mandatory register of doctors' interests. And I thought it was very well researched and really good. And please keep up your relentless support for our recommendations. And I want to say to Colin, thank you for coming. And I think you realized what a sort of debate it will be. And I want to say that your input was really, really helpful. And thank you for saying that you supported the review and all the work that we did in producing the review, listening to patients, hearing what they had to say. listening to the professions and drawing up the review. And Fiona, I think this is the dawning. I think we will go further on this. I think that Cyril was saying there needs to be a really close working with the local employers and the GMC. I understand that. I take Kath's point that actually what's happening now, although the trusts are meant to be doing this, it is like a Swiss cheese. There's sort of lots of holes in it, and it doesn't really stand up to the scrutiny that's required. So I think it's been an extremely useful session today. Thank you very much. I'll just say that our group's website will be recording what's been said today, and we will continue to press for the full implementation of all our recommendations in First Do No Harm. And this is our way of doing it, is to work through the all-party parliamentary group and also sessions in both sessions of Parliament, but also working with lots of people within the whole healthcare system. So thank you all very much indeed for coming. And Fiona, for you and your colleagues for joining us on this very important day today. Thank you very much. So I'll close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.